In some ways, my talk is going to be a little bit of a part 2 of Zeynep's talk from this morning. Zeynep, where are you? Yay, there she is. So you'd have to have been really sleeping through the entire conference or multitasking way too much and also following all the wrong people on Twitter if you didn't know the significance of today's date at this point. Yeah, it's his birthday, by the way. Happy birthday to Adam. Now, what about yesterday's date? What happened in history yesterday? Tiananmen. Speaking of 25 years later when we're all really old, 25 years ago when some of us were a little less old, actually on this date, June 5th, the day after the Chinese military gunned down protesters in Tiananmen Square, this photograph was taken. This photograph, when shown around college campuses recently by an author of a book called The People's Republic of Amnesia, she showed the photograph to about 100 students. Only about 15 recognized it. That's how effective, even in the internet age, the Chinese government has been in really erasing the public memory of what happened. And, of course, with the help of internet companies, they're highly dependent on capital from places including Wall Street and Sand Hill Road for their success. But on a more optimistic note, sticking with 25 years ago, 1989, this is a photograph from Poland. Most of the Iron Curtain crumbled in 1989. What's really interesting, I'm actually curious, how many people in the room were born after 1989? Just sort of curious. So we have a few students, and I heard we have some students and recent graduates in our midst. But what's interesting is that really, since 1989, there's been a predominant narrative in American policymaking, foreign policymaking, and in the media about kind of the way the world is going. That you have authoritarian countries kind of on one side, and you've got the democracies on the other, and that inexorably and inevitably, particularly thanks to technology, they're all going to sort of end up over with us, more like us. That's been the narrative. But what we've learned, I think, what's really been brought home to us by our friend Ed Snowden, is that we're really in danger of meeting in the middle. And as we heard from Emily Parker this morning, yes, it's true that authoritarian countries are getting a little more pluralistic. People are feeling a little more empowered thanks to technology. But we're really in danger of meeting the authoritarian countries in a really unpleasant, not very free middle if we don't do something. And that's I think, what Ed Snowden has really taught us. So what do we do? How do we move out of this kind of bad trend that we really woke up to find ourselves in a year ago, although there have been many people in this room who've been kind of yelling and screaming and warning about it for many, many years previously, thanks to the EFF, who've been suing for a decade and so on. But how do we ensure that we can even know when abuses of power are taking place, let alone constrain that power and hold it accountable to the public interest? Now, there have been a lot of people over the past year calling for Magna Cartas and bills of rights for the internet age, but actually people have been writing bills of rights and Magna Cartas for the internet really for the past decade, and this page here is a list that a group called Best Bits compiled of all the various kind of communiques and codes and declarations of internet rights that have been generated really for the past decade. I point out one of them that's worth looking at. I mean, there's quite a number. I'm going to talk about another one later. But the Internet Rights and Principles Coalition, aptly named, spent the better part of the past decade taking international human rights law, the International Declaration of Human Rights, particularly the right to freedom of expression, the right to privacy, technologically agnostic rights, and really outlining how these rights, if you're going to implement them, if governments and companies and others who hold power in the digital realm are going to respect and protect human rights in the internet age, sort of how that translates in a practical implementation sense. But the thing is that principles and declarations, I mean, they're not all that easy. You know, you kind of, you know, have a mailing list and you fight about it for a really long time. But that is the easy part. That's way easier than actually bringing about change. Because you can have principles, you can articulate how the principles translate to the internet, but now how do you actually hold those with power accountable? Not just get them to commit, but get them to do it and hold them accountable to it. That is, of course, the challenge that we're facing. Now, a lot of people here are activists, are part of what we call civil society, part of sort of the nonprofit activism community. And, you know, Zeynep talked this morning, this is where I get to part two of Zeynep's talk. Zeynep talked a lot about sort of, you know, what are our challenges and the need for more capacity that civil society needs in order to be really effective in bringing out change. And I'm going to add sort of another layer onto that, which is that I think we've also learned from the past several years of online activism and offline activism and internet-driven activism that what we need if we want meaningful, lasting victories, civil society needs to build strong alliances with the business community and with the world of professional politics. Is Marisha still here? Nice people like Marisha who really care. And it is in that sweet spot in the Venn diagram when you get the alliances between civil society, business, and politicians, and politics and government. That's where the lasting change happens. That's where you really move the dial. So going back to sort of the easy bits, as Zeynep was talking about before, of course, 2.5 years ago, it already feels like a million years ago. Many people in this room were involved with the defeat of the Stop Online Piracy Act and its evil twin, PIPA. And what was key to that defeat? There was certainly the network public sphere, but there were also strong allies amongst major powerful corporations and strong allies in government who saw it in their interest to get behind this. And that's what really brought about that victory. We also had, sort of on the international sphere, the International Telecommunications Union, a part of the UN, in late 2012, kind of made a bid to assert more jurisdiction over internet governance. It was stopped, at least for the time being, primarily due to the fact that there was an alliance, not just activists raising hell, but also very strategic alliances between the global activist community, different members of government in different countries, and key companies that really got that stopped. And it took all three together. But saying no is the easy part. What do you do about undoing the entrenched surveillance industrial complex that has been woven into the fabric of government and corporations for the past decade or so? That's the hard part. The SOPA, PIPA stuff, the ITU stuff, that was easy. Necessary and proportionate, the 13 principles, Ed Snowden mentioned these earlier this morning. This is another effort to articulate, if we're going to have law enforcement, if we're going to have national security, you know, if there are legitimate things that law enforcement and national security need to do to access data, it needs to be accountable, it needs to be bound according to basic principles of necessary and proportionate, it needs to be constrained, otherwise it will not be compatible with democracy and human rights. a group of activists have laid out these principles. No government, even the ones who've been yelling and screaming about NSA surveillance, have been willing to sign on to these or to implement these principles. And in fact, there was a meeting in Brazil just about a month ago, organized by the president of Brazil, who's very upset about NSA surveillance of her own communications. The multi-stakeholder statement that came out of that meeting, that was the result of negotiations between governments, companies, and civil society, failed to eliminate, failed to basically say, to drop government's use of mass surveillance. Basically, the statement on surveillance reserved the right of governments to use mass surveillance when necessary. And so that kind of showed that governments and companies were not willing to stand with civil society on this. We've got some ways to go, a lot of work to do. Global Voices Advocacy, Mika gave it a shout out earlier. We put out something called the Netizen Report, which is kind of tracking digital rights developments all over the world. And yeah, the bad guys are winning. That freedom of expression and privacy are under attack all over the world by governments passing laws, implementing technologies that are making it harder and harder for people to use the internet in an empowering, decentralized way. Again, when we do see victories, as I follow these stories, the few victories we do see are very much due, I've noticed, because alliances get formed and bills get stopped. And this is where the change happens. And this is where the hard work takes place. It's much more difficult than just organizing street demonstrations. Not to say that demonstrations aren't necessary, but that hard work of alliance building is difficult. Now, for those of you who were born after 1989, you know, many of you may be very inspired to become activists, and I hope many of you will. But I also hope that if I were talking to a graduating class, I would say, I hope only a third of you go into activism. I want another third of you to infiltrate business. I want another third of you to infiltrate government. Because unless we build that connective tissue between those three vectors, we're not going to win. We can win. It's going to be the work of a generation. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be tough work, not just mailing lists and street protests, but really tough work of getting yourself embedded into long-running processes and long-running organizations, working with people across different sectors that share your values to change legislation, hold companies accountable, demand transparency, implement transparency on all sides, build the movements, enable and support the movements, build human rights compatible technologies, and ensure that the public is able to participate in the development of technology's future. And if that's going to happen, we need allies. We need to all work together to make it work. So good luck. Thank you.